So I'm re-recording this second podcast on principle of locality because some scratchy sound ended up being part of the previous recording and it was not audible at all. So all these the setup I have, it's not perfect, but I have to manage anyway. So let's read about the principle of locality. So we are in a chapter called Grasping Complexity, which is a new chapter in the second edition that I'm adding to the fully recorded first edition. What is principle of locality? In addition to the constitution of complexity itself, other common characteristics of complex systems are vital for the kinds of systems we consider in this book. The first concerns that each element is always only acting in response to the inputs available to it locally, whilst being oblivious to the overall state or behavior of the complex system as a whole. So that's the first concern about complexity in its constitution. This is vital and referred to as the principle of locality. For an element to know everything happening to the system as a whole, it must be as complex as the system itself, which is impossible for the system of interest in this book. So we must divide the system, which is quite complex, into elements, and elements must be simpler, even though it means that we are assuming this principle of locality in terms of how it gets its perturbations from which nodes and how many links and so on. So the locality principle entails, in other words, that all actions are local and in response to locally changing conditions without any involved element being aware of the full effects of their actions throughout the system. Knowing this should help us develop our humility as actors in complex human environment systems and our tolerance and patience with other actors whose decisions and actions may make sense under local conditions under which they operate. Humility is a key word. I have railed against the climate community, which I am a part of, that we need more humility because our models are great, they do amazing things, but they are not perfect, especially when we project into the future beyond a couple of decades. Scenario uncertainties are huge when you look at the projections, and a lot of this sustainability pathway is about preparing for future risks, right? So we are expecting society to respond to our information as if it's got some great certainty. Even though we keep saying there are uncertainties, we are not as as humble as we should be about our information, and we are a little too pushy sometimes without knowing the amount of investment needed and the kinds of decisions that have to be made, let's say by politicians who have to worry about the next election. So it's easy to blame politicians as making short-term decisions, but the fact is scientists can provide input and not be responsible for the decisions or the outcomes, but politicians have to make decisions and will pay a price if things go wrong when it comes to elections. They are not honest, they are also human beings, but nonetheless, look at the sketch demonstrating the principle of locality, where the blue, the red and the green elements only receive inputs from their direct connections. So you have the green, blue and red and green sitting here. This one is getting direct input from 5 elements, this from 5 nodes, and this from 4 nodes, and this from 3 nodes, and of course they are related to other nodes and links as well. So the principle of locality says that this one is only going to receive signals from these, and how they are affected by their other links are not going to affect this particular element that we are talking about. A simplicity often required for dealing with this entire system, which is quite complex. Open systems have, per definition, not an unambiguous system boundary for us to adopt when constructing them to help us make sense of our often overwhelmingly intricate reality. So Earth system itself is an open system with energy coming from outside, energy going to the outside. The balance is important, and how the energy coming changes and how we change the energy going out by increasing greenhouse gases and so on matter because of internal feedbacks. The energy coming in changes, of course, because of orbital changes in obliquity, ellipticity, and eccentricity, and so on. So therefore the boundaries we set are more of a feature of our need for boundaries than the complex reality we want to understand, explain, or improve. What to include and exclude is simply an analytical choice, and all boundaries are transient given a sufficiently long time frame. So orbital forcings are a long time scale compared to the anthropogenic time scale, but glacial cycles, deglacial cycles relate to those long time scales, and they are then boundaries that are transient. And of course we are dealing with simplified systems to understand each component and how they work together. However, they are not arbitrary but demand serious consideration. The deliberations of what to include and exclude are considered boundary judgments to underline their inherently subjective nature, and making them always entail analytical sacrifice. So reductionist approach is essential to deal with this complex system. Such boundary judgments are connected in such a way to both the descriptive statements about what we know about the phenomenon or problem and prescriptive statements about our purpose and objectives for addressing them, that changing one automatically causes changes in the others. We'll look at that in a minute, but essentially we are going from understanding the current state and mapping the risks to defining a preferred state and understanding how to get there. So obviously we have to have our objective of changing that is able to deal with this descriptive and prescriptive statements about our purpose and objectives. Thus it is crucial to systematically scrutinize what is included and excluded when addressing any phenomenon or problem, and the descriptive and prescriptive statements on which those boundary judgments are based. So when we go to the last chapter in this section on approaching the world, we will look at how to represent the human environment systems, where this becomes very critical. Okay, such scrutiny is critical when multiple actors with different perspectives are involved in the process who may agree on neither. In other words, we looked at rolling hills from the perspective of a herder or a grazer, a farmer and a real estate agent, and how they described and prescribe the use and the change are very different. What they value are very different, right? The systematic scrutiny of what to include and exclude is called boundary critique, and must be practiced carefully when managing risk and resilience for sustainable development. The notion of something is better than nothing is misleading concerning the construction of system boundaries, for which take nothing for granted may be more appropriate. If you're trying to deal with a system and you construct something and say, well, something is better than nothing, then you may actually end up creating more problems than improving understanding and finding solutions. So take nothing for granted is a better paradigm. Chapter 11 provides guidelines for approaching this boundary challenge in practice. For now, it is enough to appreciate the need for humility about our limited ability to represent reality, and for blatant openness about the incompleteness and provisionality of the results. So when stakeholders are involved and solutions are being co-produced and prescriptions are being agreed upon, everybody should be aware of the incompleteness and provisionality and the uncertainties, and aware that the uncertainties are sometimes irreducible, and there are always irreducible risks along the way. And resilience, as we said repeatedly, just means that we keep coming back to the sustainability pathway and not completely go off the cliff, right? So the nexus of boundary judgments, descriptive statements and prescriptive statements, we looked at this before, but worth looking at it again in this context of grasping complexity. Descriptive statements are observations and facts where we looked at the current state or the state of our world and how our past determines our present, and we had boundary judgments that are feeding back to the descriptive statements themselves, and out of that comes the preferred state and the prescriptive statements with evaluations and values, which is also feeding back with the descriptive statements as well as with the boundary judgments. Okay, so it is obviously a very complex system. So we'll come back and look at manifestations of complexity in the next podcast. Even though this is a little short, I want to make sure that the sound is okay with this. Okay, so we'll continue if the sound is okay, otherwise I'll have to go back and re-record it, and I'm feeling hungry. It's lunchtime for me, and I have a fan running in the background which hopefully didn't introduce any noise into the recording either. I don't run the AC, it's very hot. Summer is here in Mumbai, it's humid, so I have to deal with all these things and the sound system which keeps flaking out on me. Okay, see you in the next podcast on manifestation of complexity.